In the pre-dawn gloom of June 4th, 1942, numerous young Japanese aviators occupy their cockpits aboard 4 aircraft carriers, drawing deep breaths of the Pacific morning atmosphere. Others receive instructions in briefing rooms, poring over their objective maps for the final time. Still more, maintenance personnel and flight deck crews perform last-minute adjustments on aircraft destined to etch their names in history. Unbeknownst to them, 240 miles to the northeast, 3 American carriers are already turning into the wind, poised to launch their own assaults. Within mere hours, what was intended to be Japan's decisive triumph, the eradication of American naval air power in the Pacific, will instead transform into the Empire's most devastating setback. 4 Japanese carriers that had emerged victorious at Pearl Harbor will descend beneath the waves, carrying with them not merely metal and fuel, but the aspirations of Japanese expansion and over 3,000 irreplaceable airmen and mariners. This moment marked the culmination of 6 months of victories. Now, for the very first time, this crucial engagement will be witnessed through the perspectives of those who experienced its defeat. The Japanese admirals who devised the strategy, the pilots who executed the sorties, and the sailors who perished in its execution. This is the Battle of Midway. It is the spring of 1942, 2 months prior to the calamity at Midway. Presently in Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, is engaged in intense disagreements with the Naval General Staff. Matters are not progressing with the smoothness the public perceives. The preceding December's assault on Pearl Harbor, while tactically brilliant, had failed to neutralize even a single American aircraft carrier. This reality weighs heavily on Yamamoto's every waking moment. The USS Enterprise and USS Lexington were at sea during the attack. Now, 6 months later, these carriers continue to inflict damage upon Japanese forces across the Pacific. Compounding the issue, on April 18th, American B-25 bombers, launched from the carrier USS Hornet, had appeared above Tokyo itself. The Doolittle raid, an unthinkable indignity for the Japanese military that had pledged to shield the emperor from all harm. This raid, though causing minimal material damage, had precipitated a psychological upheaval within Japanese leadership. The vulnerability of the homeland had been revealed, and accountability was demanded. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had spearheaded the Pearl Harbor offensive, was particularly discomposed. He had faced criticism for refraining from a third wave at Pearl Harbor, for failing to locate the American carriers, and now Tokyo itself had been subjected to aerial bombardment. The imperative for decisive action was overwhelming, yet the Japanese High Command remained, as ever, profoundly fractured. In the seats of power, 2 competing strategic paths emerged. The Naval General Staff, characterized by conservatism and caution, championed a southern trajectory, advocating for the continued consolidation of gains in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, thereby severing the logistical arteries between America and Australia. Admiral Yamamoto, however, harbored a different vision, one born of both opportunity and desperation. He possessed knowledge that few others in Japan truly grasped. Time was not on their side. During his tenure in America, studying at Harvard and serving as a naval attaché, Yamamoto had directly observed America's industrial prowess. He had witnessed the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the shipyards of Newport News, and the boundless agricultural lands capable of sustaining millions of laborers. Once America's war-making apparatus achieved full operational capacity, Japan would be overwhelmed by sheer material superiority. As Yamamoto would convey to Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe in a documented exchange from 1940, "If we are ordered to do it, then I can guarantee to put up a tough fight for the first 6 months, but I have absolutely no confidence as to what would happen if it went on for 2 or 3 years." This forecast would prove eerily accurate. In another verified statement from September 1941, he had cautioned, "For a while, we'll have everything our own way, stretching out in every direction like an octopus spreading its tentacles, but it'll last for 1.5 years at the most." The proposed solution, Yamamoto contended, was Operation MI, the conquest of Midway, a diminutive pair of islands, comprising a mere 6 square miles of coral and sand, yet possessing strategic significance far exceeding its physical dimensions. Situated 1,100 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor, Midway served as America's most westerly bastion, a vital refueling point for submarines and aircraft patrolling the Central Pacific. More crucially for Yamamoto, Midway would function as bait, irresistible bait that would lure the American carriers from their anchorage at Pearl Harbor. When they appeared to defend the atoll, the superior Japanese fleet would annihilate them in a decisive engagement, the Kai Kessen, which Japanese naval doctrine had consistently envisioned. The plan was intricate, perhaps excessively so. It entailed the coordinated action of multiple formations dispersed across thousands of miles of ocean. An invasion fleet to seize Midway, a carrier strike force to neutralize American air power, a main body comprised of battleships, including Yamamoto's flagship, the formidable Yamato, and even a diversionary assault on the Aleutian Islands to misdirect the Americans. Approximately 200 vessels in total, constituting the largest fleet Japan had ever mobilized. The operational directives alone spanned 700 pages, distributed mere days before the fleet's departure, affording subordinate commanders scant time for their study. Opposition to the plan was substantial, but ultimately futile. Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, conducted war games in early May that yielded disquieting outcomes. In the tabletop simulations, the American carriers materialized earlier than anticipated and inflicted severe damage upon the Japanese fleet. However, these results were effectively disregarded. The arbiters arbitrarily reduced the number of American hits and revived Japanese vessels that had been sunk during the exercise. When Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, the astute tactical planner responsible for the Pearl Harbor attack, voiced apprehensions regarding the operation's complexity and the carrier's vulnerability, he was dismissed. The victory disease, that fatal overconfidence stemming from 6 months of effortless conquests, had permeated even the most brilliant intellects within the Imperial Navy. The Japanese erroneously believed they had sunk 2 American carriers at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May. In reality, they had destroyed only one, the USS Lexington. They assumed the USS Yorktown was so critically damaged that it would be incapacitated for months. Japanese intelligence had failed to ascertain the frantic repair efforts underway at Pearl Harbor, where 1,400 workers toiled ceaselessly to patch up the Yorktown in a mere 3 days, an achievement Japanese shipyards could never have replicated. They calculated that the Americans could muster at most 2 operational carriers to confront them. Concurrently, the individual selected to command the carrier strike force, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, harbored profound personal doubts. Nagumo was not a carrier admiral by training or disposition. A torpedo specialist whose appointment to command the First Air Fleet was based more on seniority than expertise, he had never been comfortable with naval aviation. At Pearl Harbor, his prudence had forestalled a 3rd strike that might have obliterated the American fuel depots and repair facilities. Now, he was tasked with leading an even more convoluted operation with an increasingly depleted force. His carriers had been deployed almost continuously since Pearl Harbor, striking Darwin, Rabaul, and supporting operations from the Indian Ocean to the Coral Sea. His air crews were exhausted, and the vessels required maintenance. Most troublingly, the recent Battle of the Coral Sea in May had exacted a heavy toll on Japan. While a tactical Japanese victory, marked by the sinking of the Lexington, it proved strategically a setback. The carrier Shokaku had sustained significant damage and necessitated months of repairs. Its sister ship, Zuikaku, had lost so many aircraft and pilots that it was unable to participate in the Midway operation. 2 of Japan's premier carriers would be conspicuously absent from the decisive confrontation. As Nagumo confided to his chief of staff, Captain Ryunosuke Kusaka, "We are being asked to do too much with too little. The Americans have had time to prepare. Our pilots are tired, and we don't even know where their carriers are. Yamamoto is gambling with the fate of the empire. Yet, perhaps the most fatal deficiency in the Japanese strategy lay in intelligence and mindset. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, the Americans had successfully deciphered the Japanese Navy's JN-25B code. Commander Joseph Rochefort, stationed at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, had been intercepting Japanese communications since early 1942. The Americans were privy to Operation MI, knew the objective was Midway, confirmed through the celebrated AF ruse, whereby Midway transmitted falsified reports of water shortages via secure cable, subsequently intercepting Japanese messages indicating that AF was indeed experiencing water scarcity, thus revealing the approximate date of the assault. Admiral Chester Nimitz possessed the complete Japanese order of battle and could thus position his forces accordingly. The intended Japanese submarine cordon, designed to detect American ships departing Pearl Harbor, would arrive on station too late. The American carriers had already passed through the zone. The planned aerial reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor by flying boats, Operation K, was aborted when the submarine I-169 discovered American warships, the USS Thornton and USS Pella, occupying French frigate shoals, the designated refueling site. This had succeeded in March when two Kawanishi H-8K flying boats had refueled there from submarines to bomb Oahu, but Nimitz had learned from that raid. One by one, the means by which the Americans might have detected the impending ambush were being systematically neutralized. Radio intelligence did, however, signal increased American submarine activity and message traffic in the vicinity of Midway. The apparent ease with which the Americans had located Japanese forces at the Coral Sea suggested that their codes might be compromised. However, these warnings were disregarded. As one staff officer remarked, "The Americans are too stupid to break our codes and too cowardly to fight unless they have overwhelming superiority. They will come to Midway only after we have taken it, and then we will destroy them." On May the 27th, the anniversary of Admiral Togo's monumental victory over the Russians at Tsushima, Nagumo's carrier strike force, the Kidobutai, departed the inland sea. 4 carriers set sail: Akagi, Red Castle, Yamamoto's former command, and Nagumo's flagship. Kaga, Increased Joy, the converted battleship. Hiryu, Flying Dragon, and Soryu, Green Dragon. Collectively, they carried 248 aircraft, including 211 destined for Midway, with 225 operational for combat, crewed by the most experienced naval aviators in the world. These were the vessels and the men who had decimated Pearl Harbor, who had rampaged from Hawaii to Rabaul. Surely, nothing could impede them. Commander Minoru Genda, still recuperating from his emergency appendectomy but serving as Nagumo's air operations officer despite his ailment, made a final diary entry prior to departure. "We sail with heavy hearts. This operation has been rushed. Our intelligence is poor and the plan is too complex, but we are samurai. We will do our duty even if it leads to death. May the gods protect Japan, for I fear we sail toward catastrophe." The fatal flaw of overconfidence was perhaps most strikingly demonstrated by the treatment of Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack. In late May, Fuchida underwent an emergency appendectomy aboard a Kaga. The surgery rendered him too infirm to fly, thus depriving the Japanese of their most seasoned strike leader at the most critical juncture. According to subsequent testimonies from other officers, Fuchida observed the preparations from his sickbed with mounting unease, sensing that every aspect of this operation felt fundamentally flawed. The timing, the strategy, the very atmosphere seemed laden with impending disaster. Nevertheless, historians note that Fuchida's post-war accounts must be approached with caution, as contemporary scholarship has challenged many of his assertions. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 3rd, 600 miles to the north, the Aleutian Islands operation commences. Rear Admiral Kakuji Kakuta's 2nd Carrier Strike Force, comprising the light carriers Ryujo and Junyo, launches assaults against Dutch Harbor in Alaska. This maneuver is intended as the Great Diversion to draw American forces northward while Nagumo assaults Midway. However, unbeknownst to the Japanese, the Americans have not taken the bait. Admiral Chester Nimitz, fully apprised by his code breakers of the true objective, has maintained his carriers near Midway. The elaborate deception has misled no one but the Japanese themselves. Meanwhile, Nagumo's carriers navigate through fog toward their launching point, observing strict radio silence, which will prevent any coordination between the widely separated formations. In the ready rooms, pilots receive their final briefings. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, who will lead the initial strike, studies the reconnaissance photographs of Midway one last time. The images are weeks old, but they depict the airfield, the fuel storage, and the defensive emplacements. What they fail to reveal is the recent reinforcement of the island, the additional fighter and bomber aircraft, and most crucially, the radar installation that will detect the Japanese strike while it is still 93 miles distant. That evening, American PBY Catalina flying boats detect portions of the Japanese invasion fleet 700 miles west of Midway. This initial contact electrifies the American command. Navy pilot Ensign Jack Reed, flying a PBY, reports at 0925, sighted main body bearing 262, distance 700. However, Nagumo's carriers remain undetected, concealed by weather and distance. On the bridge of the Akagi, the tension is palpable. Chief of Staff Kusaka approaches Nagumo. "Sir," he states, "if the Americans have spotted the invasion force, they may be more alert than we expected." Nagumo dismisses the concern. "The invasion force is supposed to be seen. It will draw them out. Tomorrow, we will destroy their air power on Midway, and when their carriers arrive to counterattack, we will be waiting." But even as Nagumo utters these confident words, 300 miles to the northeast, Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard the USS Enterprise is plotting the probable location of the Japanese carrier force. The American carriers are precisely where they ought not to be, according to Japanese calculations. Already at sea, already in position, already preparing to strike. Task Force 16 under Spruance, comprising the Enterprise and Hornet, and Task Force 17 under Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, with the hastily repaired Yorktown, have reached Point Luck, their designated rendezvous point northeast of Midway, undetected by any Japanese reconnaissance. The weather is clear, the seas are calm, providing perfect flying conditions with visibility extending for miles. At precisely 4:30, the Akagi and Kaga commence launching the initial wave against Midway. The launch proceeds without incident. 36 D-3A Val dive bombers, 36 Nakajima B-5N Kate-level bombers, and 36 Mitsubishi ASM-0 fighters. Lieutenant Tomonaga leads them into the lightning-streaked sky, circling the fleet once before heading southeast toward Midway, 240 miles distant. As the 108 aircraft form up and depart, Nagumo makes his first fateful decision of the day. Despite doctrine dictating a full deckload strike to maximize impact, he withholds 108 aircraft, Kates armed with Type 91 torpedoes and 800-kilogram armor-piercing bombs, intended for use against American vessels, should they appear. This appears prudent, but it will prove catastrophic. Below decks in the hangar of the Akagi, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida observes the launch from his sickbed, still recovering from his appendectomy. The absence of his experience and tactical acumen will be keenly felt in the hours ahead. According to witness accounts from other officers, Fuchida expressed profound apprehension regarding the operation, although his precise words remain unsubstantiated in contemporary documents. At Zo-5 Nagumo launches his search planes, a mere 7 aircraft tasked with covering a vast expanse of ocean. In contrast, the Americans have deployed over 30 PBYs to scour the seas for the Japanese fleet. Most critically, the search plane dispatched from the heavy cruiser Tone, designated as Scout Number 4 and assigned to patrol the sector where the American carriers are actually located, launches 30 minutes behind schedule. Various sources attribute this delay to catapult malfunctions, though some suggest engine issues or bureaucratic holdups. This single mechanical failure will precipitate a cascade of calamitous events. Ironically, recent scholarship indicates that had the aircraft launched on time, its search pattern might have entirely missed the American task forces. At 0534, PBY pilot Lieutenant Howard Adey spots the Japanese carriers and transmits the electrifying message, "Enemy carriers." He follows this with further details at 0552, "Two carriers and battleships bearing 320 degrees, distance 180 miles, course 135, speed 25. On the Enterprise, Spruance makes a command decision that will prove pivotal to the battle's outcome. Despite the extreme range, nearly 200 miles, he orders an immediate strike. His aircraft will have barely enough fuel to return, but he aims to catch the Japanese at their most vulnerable moment, recovering their Midway strike. Meanwhile, at 0553, radar on Midway detects the approaching Japanese strike 93 miles out. Air raid sirens wail across the tiny atoll. Every available aircraft is scrambled. Bombers to attack the Japanese fleet, fighters to defend. Marine fighters ascend into the air. 20 obsolete Brewster F-2A Buffaloes and 7 Grumman F-4F Wildcats. They are outnumbered 4-1 by the escorting Zeros. The interception occurs at 0616. Marine Major Floyd Parks, leading the defenders, makes his final radio transmission. Hawks at Angels 14, supported by fighters. The ensuing engagement is swift and brutal. The Zeros, with their superior maneuverability and experienced pilots, tear through the Marine formation. Within minutes, 13 Marine fighters are shot down and 4 sustain severe damage. Major Parks is among the fallen. The Zeros lose only 3 aircraft. At 0630, Tomonaga's strike force arrives over Midway. The dive bombers and level bombers execute their attacks with precision, igniting fuel tanks, demolishing structures, and cratering the runway. But as Tomonaga circles to assess the damage, he observes something disconcerting. American aircraft are still taking off from the supposedly devastated airfield. The runway, though damaged, remains operational. Most significantly, none of the American aircraft were caught on the ground. They had all been launched prior to the strike's arrival. At 07:00, Tomonaga radios Nagumo, "There is need for a second attack wave." This message reaches Nagumo at 07:00, precisely as the first American strikes from Midway begin to arrive. First come 6 TBF Avengers and 4 B-26 Marauders, armed with torpedoes. The Zeros assigned to combat air patrol swarm them. 5 Avengers are shot down, and 2 B-26s are destroyed. However, one B-26, nicknamed Susie Q, and piloted by Lieutenant James Murray, makes a desperate run directly at the Akagi after releasing its torpedo. According to numerous Japanese witnesses, including bridge personnel, the bomber roared down the entire length of the Akagi's flight deck, its gunners strafing and killing 2 sailors. The aircraft pulled up at the last possible second, narrowly clearing the bridge where Nagumo and his staff ducked for cover. Murray's aircraft sustained over 500 bullet holes and lost hydraulic fluid, yet somehow managed to return to Midway. A second B-26, piloted by Lieutenant Herbert Mays and heavily damaged, actually crashed into the ocean near the Akagi's bridge, possibly in an attempted deliberate ramming attack. This near miss has a profound psychological impact. As Captain Kusaka would later testify, the Admiral was visibly shaken. To have an enemy plane nearly crash into the bridge, it was as if the war god had given us a warning. Further American attacks follow in rapid succession. 16 Marine dive bombers, led by Major Lofton Henderson, who would perish leading his squadron, 15 B-17 bombers from high altitude, and 11 Marine Vindicators. All are repulsed with heavy losses, scoring no hits, but they compel the Japanese carriers to engage in evasive maneuvers, preventing them from conducting flight operations efficiently. At 07:15, Nagumo faces a critical decision. His reserve aircraft are armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for ship attacks. Tominaga requires reinforcement at Midway, and no enemy aircraft carriers have been sighted. Following intense deliberations with his advisors, Nagumo issues a directive that proves decisive. Torpedoes are to be removed, and bombs designed for land assault are to be loaded. This action directly contravenes Yamamoto's explicit instructions to maintain readiness for anti-ship engagements. Throughout the hangar decks of all 4 carriers, pandemonium ensues. Ordnance crews commence the arduous task of disassembling Type 91 torpedoes and 800-kilogram armor-piercing bombs, substituting them with smaller munitions intended for ground targets. Disregarding established regulations and safety protocols, the dismantled torpedoes are staged within the hangar spaces instead of being returned to the munitions magazines located far below. Time is of the essence. Bombs are piled adjacent to the aircraft. Fuel lines crisscross the decks as aircraft are refueled. As one mechanic, Airman Mai, would later attest, had he survived, the hangar deck resembled a munitions factory. "One spark, and we would all perish," he reportedly said. At 0728, the situation transforms. The delayed scout plane from Tone No. 4 finally transmits its report. It indicates sighting what appear to be 10 enemy surface vessels bearing 010 degrees at a distance of 240 miles from Midway. Their course is 150 degrees with a speed exceeding 20 knots. Nagumo immediately transmits a signal to ascertain the types of vessels. The response is delayed by 12 agonizing minutes. Meanwhile, the reconfiguration continues, rendering the hangar decks increasingly encumbered with ordnance. At 0745, another American assault arrives. 16 Marine dive bombers from VMSB 241, under the command of Major Henderson, engage. The Zero fighters viciously attack them, downing 8 aircraft, but the assaults persist, forcing drastic evasive maneuvers that disrupt flight operations. Nagumo finds himself in an untenable predicament. His fighter aircraft are depleted of fuel and ammunition from continuously repelling attacks. Tominaga's strike force is imminent, also low on fuel. His decks are occupied by aircraft undergoing rearmament. And somewhere in the expanse, American surface vessels, potentially including carriers, are present. At 0809, Tone's scout plane, No. 4, finally provides clarification. The enemy fleet comprises 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Nagumo exhales a sigh of relief, noting the absence of carriers, and continues with the rearmament for a second Midway attack. However, at 0820, another message shatters his composure. The enemy fleet is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding the 2nd Carrier Division from Hiryu, immediately signals Nagumo at 0830, "Consider it advisable to launch attack force immediately." Yamaguchi, exhibiting aggression and decisiveness, perceives the danger with clarity. Every moment of delay amplifies vulnerability. Yet, Nagumo hesitates. His aircraft are in disarray, some armed with bombs, others with torpedoes, many not armed at all. His fighters require landing and refueling. Tominaga's returning strike is approaching. To launch immediately would result in a fragmented, uncoordinated assault lacking fighter escort, a violation of every tenet of Japanese carrier doctrine. Commander Minorugu Genda, despite his illness following an appendectomy, is consulted. According to testimonies from staff officers, he advocated for an immediate launch, asserting, "Speed is everything now. Launch what we have." However, Captain Kusaka advises caution. "If we attack piecemeal, we'll suffer heavy losses for little gain. Better to recover our aircraft, properly arm them, and launch a fully constituted strike according to doctrine." Nagumo, characteristically cautious and adhering strictly to established procedures, aligns with Kusaka's recommendation. "We will recover Tominaga's force, rearm and refuel properly, and then strike with full strength." He signals all carriers. "After completing recovery of aircraft, we shall proceed north to engage the enemy." This decision, logical, prudent, and ultimately disastrous, seals the fate of the Kido Butai. As Tominaga's planes begin landing at 0837 and are moved below for refueling and rearming, the hangar decks transform into death traps. Fuel lines are ubiquitous. Bombs and torpedoes are strewn about. The constant movement of elevators brings aircraft up and down. Safety protocols are entirely abandoned in the frantic effort to prepare for launch. No one notices the initial American torpedo planes appearing on the horizon until it is too late. At 0920, the first American carrier aircraft arrive. 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8 VT-8, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. Devoid of fighter escort, piloting obsolescent aircraft at a mere 100 knots, flying barely above the waves, they press their attack against the entire Japanese fleet. The Zero fighters on combat air patrol, finally presented with worthy targets after hours of repelling land-based assaults, descend like predators upon their prey. The carnage is absolute. One by one, the slow, vulnerable torpedo bombers are shot down. All 15 are destroyed. Of the 30 aircrew, only one survives. Ensign George Gay, who would float in the water, concealed beneath his seat cushion, observing the remainder of the engagement. Not a single torpedo finds its mark, but Waldron's sacrifice is not in vain. The Zeros are drawn down to sea level, focused on the torpedo planes. At 0954, 14 Devastators from Enterprise's VT-6 arrive, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay. Once again, the Zeros swarm downwards. 10 are shot down, 4 escape, and no hits are scored. At 10:12, Devastators from Yorktown's VT-3 attack, led by Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey. 10 more are downed. Still no torpedo hits. Of the 41 torpedo bombers that attack, only 6 survive. It appears to be another devastating assault with no tangible result. On the bridge of Akagi, a sense of relief, even jubilation, prevails. The American assaults have been repulsed with catastrophic losses. Nagumo orders the strike force to prepare for launch at 10:30. Victory seems within reach, but high above, unnoticed while every Zero is at sea level, 2 formations of SBD Dauntless dive bombers arrive simultaneously. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading 33 dive bombers from Enterprise, had ventured beyond his calculated interception point, risking his fuel to locate the Japanese. He had observed the destroyer Arashi speeding northward. It had been depth-charging the submarine USS Nautilus and followed its course directly to the Kido Butai. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's 17 dive bombers from Yorktown arrived from a different vector at the same moment. At 10:20, lookouts on Akagi scream, "Hell divers!" But it is too late. With the Zeros at sea level, with the decks crowded with fueled and armed aircraft, with bombs and torpedoes scattered throughout the hangar spaces, the Japanese carriers are perfectly exposed. At 10:22, McCluskey initiates his dive from 14,500 feet. Behind him, his squadrons roll into their attack dives. The rising sun insignia on the carrier decks below grow larger, presenting perfect targets in the clear Pacific morning. Lieutenant Commander McCluskey leads his bombers against Kaga, while Lieutenant Richard Best directs his division against Akagi. Almost concurrently, Leslie's Yorktown bombers plunge towards Soryu. The Japanese carriers, recovering from violent evasive maneuvers and with their decks packed with aircraft, are caught at their most vulnerable. On Kaga, 4 bombs strike in rapid succession. The first, a 1,000-pounder, explodes near the bridge at 10:22, instantly killing Captain Jasaku Okada and most of his command staff. The second strikes the flight deck amidships, penetrating to the hangar deck where fueled aircraft erupt in chain reactions. The third and fourth bombs transform the vessel into an inferno. Within minutes, Kaga is a burning pyre, with ammunition detonating and aviation fuel creating walls of flame. Akagi sustains just 1 direct hit at 10:24 from Lieutenant Best's bomb, but it proves sufficient. The 1,000-pound bomb penetrates the flight deck and detonates in the upper hangar amidst 18 aircraft being refueled and rearmed. The subsequent explosions of the improperly stored ordnance are catastrophic. Torpedoes detonate, bombs explode, and aviation fuel ignites an uncontrollable conflagration. Bridge personnel report that within 2 minutes, the entire hangar deck is engulfed in flames, with temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. Soryu suffers 3 direct hits in its hangar spaces at 10:25. Lieutenant Leslie's bombers deliver their ordnance with deadly accuracy. 13 Vals, 3 Zeros, and 4 Kates on the flight deck are obliterated. Below in the hangars, the stacked torpedoes and bombs trigger secondary explosions that rend through the ship's vitals. Her captain, Ryusaku Yanagimoto, refuses to abandon his burning vessel. According to the testimony of Chief Petty Officer Abe, dispatched to rescue him, Yanagimoto was last observed on the bridge, sword in hand, singing the national anthem, Kimigayo, as flames consumed the command structure. Only Hiryu, separated from the others by several miles and screened by clouds, escapes. Admiral Yamaguchi immediately prepares a counter-assault, but 3/4 of Japan's carrier striking power has been eradicated in 5 minutes. At 10:58, even as the 3 carriers burn, Yamaguchi launches 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero escorts, led by Lieutenant Mitio Kobayashi. Following the return path of the American aircraft, they locate Yorktown at 1200. Despite fierce resistance from Wildcat fighters and anti-aircraft fire, they score 3 bomb hits, leaving the American carrier adrift, burning and listing. Damage control parties work frantically, and incredibly, within 2 hours, Yorktown is underway again, making 20 knots. Yamaguchi, aggressive to the last, immediately prepares a second strike. At 13:31, only 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros are available, led by Lieutenant Tominaga. During the morning Midway strike, Tominaga's left-wing fuel tank had sustained damage. Maintenance crews had only time to fuel his right tank. Offered an opportunity to switch aircraft, Tominaga declined, stating that every plane was essential. He understood it was a one-way mission. His fuel would only suffice for the attack run. At 14:30, Tominaga's small force locates Yorktown, now proceeding at 19 knots following heroic damage control efforts. American fighters tear into the formation. Tominaga maintains his course despite his aircraft catching fire from fighter attacks. According to American witnesses, his burning aircraft maintained its torpedo run until the very final moment, releasing its torpedo before crashing into the sea. 2 torpedoes strike Yorktown at 14:45, tearing open her port side and causing a 26-degree list. This time, the damage is fatal, but at 1700, 24 dive bombers from Enterprise locate Hiryu. 4 bombs transform her into another inferno. At 17:03, Yamaguchi assembles his crew on the listing flight deck. According to survivors, he apologized for the defeat, urged them to survive and rebuild a stronger navy, then retired to his bridge with Captain Tomoko Kaku. Both chose to go down with their ship. Their bodies were never recovered. Yamaguchi's final message to Nagumo included an apology for the defeat and a wish for the emperor's fortune in war. He was posthumously promoted to vice admiral. Throughout the night of June 4th to 5th, the surviving Japanese ships attempt damage control, but it is futile. Soryu sinks at 1913 on the 4th with 711 men. Kaga follows at 1925, taking 811 sailors to the depths. At 200 on June 5th, Yamamoto, still 600 miles distant aboard his flagship Yamato, with the main body that never engaged, finally accepts reality. He signals, "Occupation of Midway is cancelled. Withdraw." Akagi proves remarkably resilient. Despite the raging fires, she remains afloat through the night. At 500 on June 5th, after all survivors are evacuated, Japanese destroyers fire 4 torpedoes into her. She finally sinks, taking 267 men with her. Hiryu, also refusing to yield easily, is scuttled at 5:10. After burning through the night, she takes 392 sailors and both her admirals into the abyss. As the sun rises on June 5th, the elite of the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force lies at the bottom of the Pacific in waters exceeding 17,000 feet in depth. Among them are 3,507 men. Of these, 2,181 perished on the carriers. Akagi lost 267, Kaga 811, Hiryu 392, and Soryu 711. Another 792 died on the heavy cruisers when Mogami was sunk, 700 dead, and Mikuma damaged, 92 dead, after they collided during night operations and were caught by American aircraft. Crucially, only 110 were aircrew. Most pilots were rescued. The greater, irreplaceable loss comprised over 700 skilled aircraft mechanics and flight deck personnel whose expertise had taken years to cultivate. The survivors rescued by destroyers are immediately segregated from the rest of the fleet to prevent news of the disaster from spreading. They are confined below decks, forbidden to communicate with anyone. The catastrophe is not entirely concluded. On June the 6th, the submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, locates the crippled Yorktown being undertowed by USS Vireo. Tanabe had been off Midway providing weather reports and had observed the morning assaults through his periscope. Now, slipping through the destroyer screen at 3 knots, he achieves what the entire Kido Butai could not. At 13:31, Tanabe fires a spread of 4 torpedoes from 1,200 yards. 2 strike Yorktown. 1 hits the destroyer Haman alongside, providing auxiliary power. Haman breaks in 2 and sinks in 4 minutes with 80 dead, many killed by her own exploding depth charges. Yorktown, struck by 2 more torpedoes, is doomed but refuses to sink immediately. She finally rolls over and sinks at 7:01 on June 7th in approximately 16,600 50 feet of water. This meager consolation, sinking the carrier that had contributed to the Kido Butai's destruction, barely registers against the scale of the Japanese defeat. Meanwhile, the heavy cruisers, Mogami and Mikuma, attempting to bombard Midway on the night of June 4th, had collided while evading submarine attack. American aircraft locate them on June 6th. Mogami is sunk with 700 hands, the highest death toll of any Japanese ship at Midway. Mikuma, heavily damaged and with 92 dead, barely makes it back to Truk. The disaster is complete. The journey home is one of shame and silence. Wounded sailors from the carriers are kept isolated in special compartments. No one is permitted to speak of what transpired. When the fleet returns to Japan at Hashima Naval Base on June 14th, they anchor at night to avoid observation. The wounded are disembarked in darkness, classified as secret patients, and taken to isolated naval hospitals where they are held under virtual arrest, quarantined even from their own families. They are forbidden any contact with the outside world. According to U.S. Naval Institute sources, they were treated in an appalling manner as disgraced failures. The survivors of the air groups are immediately reassigned to distant bases in the South Pacific without being allowed to see families or friends. The majority will perish in the subsequent battles of the Solomon Islands campaign. The carrier crews are dispersed to different ships and bases, sworn to secrecy under threat of severe punishment. The systematic cover-up begins immediately. The government prepares its propaganda. The sunken carriers Kaga and Hiryu remain on the official roster as unmanned to preserve the fiction that they still exist. No flag officers are court-martialed or even officially reprimanded, as this would necessitate admitting defeat. Information about the defeat is withheld from the Imperial Japanese Army for a full month. Even Prime Minister Hideki Tojo is kept in the dark regarding the full extent of the disaster. On June 5th, while the ships still burned, Tokyo Radio announced to the Japanese people, naval and air forces of the Empire have succeeded in inflicting heavy damage on American fleet and air forces in the Central Pacific. Later broadcasts added that Japan had achieved another smashing victory with 2 American carriers sunk. As an aside mentioned almost in passing, the loss of one carrier, Kaga was acknowledged, with Soryu's loss admitted later. Akagi and Hiryu's destruction would not be publicly acknowledged until after the war. The Japanese populace celebrated in the streets, unaware they were cheering a catastrophe. It was not until June 10th that the Tokyo press first hinted at difficulties, using vague language about operational challenges, but still maintaining the pretense of overall victory. Commander Fuchida, recuperating in the hospital from his appendectomy and burns sustained during Akagi's destruction, is visited by a naval intelligence officer who warns him, "You are forbidden to speak of what happened. As far as the world knows, we won a great victory." According to post-war accounts that must be treated cautiously given questions about Fuchida's reliability, he responded with bitter irony about the futility of building a war on falsehoods. Though this exchange cannot be independently verified, Admiral Yamamoto returns to his cabin aboard Yamato and does not emerge for 3 days. His staff hears him pacing at night, tormented by his failure. To his diary, he confides thoughts that would only be discovered after the war. According to staff officers who served with him, Yamamoto fell into a profound depression, knowing the war was now unwinnable. His prediction to Prime Minister Konoe had proven prophetic. Japan had indeed run wild for 6 months, exactly as he had foreseen. Now at Midway, occurring precisely 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the tide had turned. In a private meeting with his staff, documented by Captain Kuroshima, Yamamoto was brutally frank. "I gambled and lost. In trying to destroy the American carriers, I have lost our own. The war is not lost yet, but I fear I have lost the means to win it." To his close friend, Rear Admiral Taichi, he would later write a letter that survived the war. "The defeat at Midway was not a matter of bad luck or enemy superiority in numbers. It was the result of our own overconfidence and poor planning. We underestimated American capabilities and overestimated our own. Now we will pay the price for our hubris. I give Japan perhaps 18 months before the situation becomes completely hopeless." His prediction would prove optimistic. Within 18 months, Japan would lose the Marianas, and American B-29s would be within range of the home islands. The true cost of Midway extends far beyond the 4 carriers and 3,507 dead. Japan has lost over 100 of its best pilots, men with years of training and combat experience from China to the Indian Ocean. The pilot training program, which requires a minimum of 2 years to produce a combat-ready aviator and far longer to create an expert, cannot replace them. More critically, the over 700 skilled aircraft mechanics, armorers, and flight deck crew who perished represent institutional knowledge that took decades to develop. These men knew every rivet of their aircraft, every quirk of their carrier operations. As Admiral Ugaki writes in his diary, later captured and translated, "We can build new carriers in 2 years. We cannot build new pilots with the experience of those we lost. And we will never replace the skilled maintenance crews who knew how to keep our aircraft flying under combat conditions." The real tragedy of Midway is not the ships, but the men. Japanese naval aviation never recovers. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea 2 years later, in June 1944, inexperienced Japanese pilots will be massacred in what Americans call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese naval aviators, flying against veteran American pilots in superior aircraft, lose over 600 planes while inflicting minimal damage. The seeds of that disaster were sown in the waters off Midway. Midway marks the end of Japanese expansion. Within the Imperial General Headquarters, the reality slowly sinks in. Despite the propaganda, the planned invasions of Fiji, Samoa, and Hawaii are quietly cancelled. The proposed Operation FS to sever supply lines between America and Australia is abandoned. Instead, Japan is compelled into a defensive war it cannot win. The Americans, their confidence soaring, begin planning their counteroffensive. Guadalcanal, just 2 months away, will initiate the protracted, bloody American advance toward Japan. The psychological impact is equally devastating. the once unassailable prestige of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a reputation meticulously crafted since their triumph over Russia at Tsushima in 1905, was irrevocably shattered. As Fleet Commander Tamichihara chronicled in his personal writings, following the confrontation at Midway, any sense of certainty vanished. We entered engagements expecting only defeat. Conversely, American forces advanced with an ingrained conviction of their impending triumph. The entire psychological dynamic of the conflict underwent a radical transformation within those mere 5 minutes when our aircraft carriers sustained critical hits. Within the naval establishment, a torrent of acrimonious blame began immediately, though it was never aired publicly. Vice Admiral Nagumo, despite adhering to established naval doctrine, was made the scapegoat for this catastrophic loss and was subsequently reassigned to land-based duties. He would never again command a carrier formation. In 1944, during the American amphibious assault on Saipan, where he was then leading ground troops, he took his own life rather than endure capture. Admiral Ugaki, in his private journal entries, lamented, "Nagumo's career as a commander is over. Someone must bear responsibility, and it cannot be Admiral Yamamoto." This crushing defeat also laid bare profound deficiencies within Japanese military culture. There was a pervasive inflexibility in thought, an inability to adapt to unforeseen circumstances, and a dogmatic adherence to pre-established doctrine even when prevailing conditions drastically shifted. All these ingrained cultural tendencies that contributed to the disaster were acknowledged but proved impossible to rectify. The identical rigid command structure and unyielding mindset that precipitated the debacle at Midway would repeatedly manifest throughout the remainder of the war. Post-war examinations revealed the cascade of critical failures that culminated in the disaster. The Japanese operational plan was excessively intricate, with deployed forces spread across vast distances, rendering mutual support impossible. A rigorously enforced policy of radio silence prevented any effective coordination when the meticulously crafted plans began to unravel. The intelligence gathering was exceptionally poor. The Japanese possessed no awareness of the American aircraft carriers already at sea, while American intelligence, through diligent code-breaking efforts, had complete knowledge of all Japanese intentions. The failure of reconnaissance was particularly devastating. Merely 7 search aircraft were tasked with covering an enormous expanse of ocean, starkly contrasting with the more than 30 American PBY Catalina flying boats deployed for similar duties. Operation K's reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor was aborted due to the presence of American vessels near French frigate shoals. The submarine patrol, established too late, failed to detect the American carriers departing Pearl Harbor. Furthermore, the crucial half-hour delay in launching the Tone's scout plane proved fatal. Each individual failing might not have been terminal in isolation. However, in their aggregate, they ensured the calamitous outcome. Perhaps most significantly, the Japanese forces fundamentally underestimated American capabilities while simultaneously overestimating their own. They operated under the erroneous assumption that American cryptographers could not decipher their codes. In reality, they had. They presumed the carrier Yorktown could not be repaired with sufficient speed. It was made operational again in just 72 hours. They believed American pilots were of inferior skill. At Midway, American dive bomber pilots demonstrated their devastating effectiveness. They conjectured that American carriers would arrive only after Midway had been secured. Instead, they lay in wait, poised for an ambush. The failures in damage control were equally revealing. Japanese carriers, with their enclosed hangar decks and inadequate firefighting apparatus, transformed into veritable death traps when struck. American carriers, featuring open hangar decks and superior damage control measures, proved substantially more resilient. The Yorktown absorbed immense damage and might have survived the engagement had it not been for a subsequent submarine torpedo attack. The Japanese carriers were consumed by catastrophic fires ignited by single bomb hits, a consequence of their flawed fuel system design and insufficient ammunition handling procedures. Admiral Yamamoto himself would not long outlive the defeat that he recognized as dooming Japan. On April 18, 1943, American codebreakers intercepted his itinerary. Lockheed P-38 Lightning fighter aircraft intercepted his transport plane over Bougainville and shot it down. His demise, occurring precisely 1 year after the Doolittle raid, which had precipitated the Midway battle, carried a poignant sense of retribution. Discovered in the dense jungle foliage, still secured in his seat with his sword by his side, Yamamoto carried to his grave the full comprehension of how Japan had lost the war in those pivotal 5 minutes at Midway. Prior to his death, in one of his final correspondences to a friend who survived the conflict, Yamamoto articulated his thoughts with striking clarity. At Midway, we learned that conflicts are not won solely through sheer spiritual fortitude. They are secured through intelligence, encompassing both astute information gathering and the wisdom to apply it effectively. We possessed neither. Our pride prevented us from considering the possibility that the Americans might anticipate our arrival. Our rigidity hindered adaptation when our strategies faltered, and our arrogance prevented us from acknowledging that our codes might have been compromised. Pride precedes a fall, and our pride was boundless. Consequently, the outcome was an inevitability. The most profound irony of Midway lies in its fulfillment of Yamamoto's objective, albeit in a diametrically opposed manner. It was indeed the decisive engagement he had sought, but it was Japan, not America, that suffered the decisive defeat. The very carriers he had intended to trap had instead ensnared him. The ambush he had meticulously planned became the ambush he endured. The doctrine of a decisive battle, upon which Japanese naval strategy had been constructed for 40 years, was proven correct. However, it was the Americans who ultimately achieved this decisive victory. As documented in Japanese military records, Yamamoto had harbored genuine apprehension regarding America's immense industrial capacity. In early 1942, he remarked to his staff, "A military man can scarcely take pride in having vanquished a sleeping foe. It is rather a matter of shame for the one who is vanquished. I would prefer you render your assessment after observing the enemy's response, for it is certain that, angered and provoked, he will soon launch a determined counteroffensive." At Midway, that counteroffensive arrived with devastating effectiveness. The Americans had not only recovered from the attack on Pearl Harbor, but had skillfully turned Japanese strategy against them. The war would persist for an additional 3 years, but its ultimate resolution was effectively determined within those 5 minutes on June 4, 1942. Beyond the strategic ramifications, Midway represented a profound human tragedy. In the waters, located 325 miles northwest of Midway, 3,570 Japanese sailors and airmen perished. These were young men who had penned their final letters to their families that very morning, who had shared rice and tea for their breakfast, who harbored dreams of victory and a return to their homes. They met their end in infernos that reached 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, drowned in waters slicked with oil, or were dismembered by explosions that could be heard for miles. Lieutenant Hashimoto, one of the few survivors from the engine room of the Akagi, testified during post-war investigations. "The cries of burning men still echo in my nightmares. We were powerless to rescue them. The passageways were impassable due to fire. The ladders melted from the intense heat. We could only listen as they perished. Their voices called for their mothers, for water, for death to end their torment. Every night, I still hear them." The families back in Japan received no truthful account of the events during the war. They were informed that their sons had died heroically for the emperor in a great victory. Mothers proudly displayed gold stars in their windows, cherishing their sacrifice, utterly unaware that it was in service of a defeat that had sealed Japan's fate. The truth would only surface after the war, compounding their grief with a sense of betrayal. Many families found it difficult to accept even then, so complete had been the deception. Petty Officer Tanaka, who survived the sinking of the Soryu, recollected the morning prior to the battle. "We were so confident. We joked about which American vessel we would sink. Yamada declared he would sink a battleship. Suzuki claimed he would shoot down 5 American aircraft. They were both 18 years old. Both perished when the bombs struck. Their remains were never recovered. Sometimes I wonder if they are still down there, standing at their posts, awaiting orders that will never arrive. Today, the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers rest at depths exceeding 17,000 feet. Their precise locations were only recently identified by deep-sea explorer Robert Ballard and subsequent expeditions. They serve as war graves, silent testaments to the perils of hubris and the immense cost of conflict. The aircraft that once launched from their decks, spreading destruction across the Pacific, lie mangled within their hangar bays. The skeletal remains of their crews still occupy their battle stations, eternal sentinels guarding vessels that will never again sail. From the Japanese perspective, Midway signifies the moment when aspirations of empire catastrophically collided with the stark realities of the global conflict. It served as irrefutable proof that spiritual strength alone cannot surmount material inferiority, that valor devoid of sound judgment leads to ruin, and that inflexible thinking is incapable of adapting to dynamic circumstances. It was Japan's fated encounter with destiny, and destiny proved unforgiving. The defeat at Midway did more than destroy ships and claim lives. It shattered deeply held illusions. The pervasive myth of Japanese invincibility, the unwavering faith in spiritual superiority over material might, the conviction that sheer determination could overcome any obstacle, all perished alongside the carriers. In their wake emerged a grim realization. Japan had initiated a war it could not win against an adversary it had critically underestimated, employing strategies rendered obsolete by modern warfare. Yet, from the devastation of defeat arose a transformed Japan, one that renounced armed conflict, embraced democratic principles, and emerged as a beacon of peace and prosperity. The samurai spirit that once fueled territorial expansion now drives technological innovation. The nation that once sought dominance over the Pacific now plays a vital role in maintaining its peace. The advanced engineering capabilities that once constructed formidable aircraft carriers are now dedicated to producing automobiles and computers. In this remarkable transformation, perhaps the 3,570 souls lost at Midway did not perish entirely in vain. The battle also serves as a solemn admonishment to all nations regarding the inherent dangers of overconfidence and rigid strategic thinking. The Japanese military, despite its demonstrated tactical brilliance and the valor of its personnel, became a victim of its own success, a phenomenon often termed victory disease. The ingrained assumption that past successes would inevitably repeat, that adversaries would behave predictably, and that superior spirit would triumph over material disadvantages permeated decision-making at every echelon of command. The very Navy that had executed the audacious Pearl Harbor attack with such precision just 6 months earlier now fumbled basic reconnaissance protocols, disregarded crucial intelligence warnings, and blundered into an ambush that should have been readily apparent. As we reflect on Midway from the Japanese viewpoint, we see not malevolent figures, but human beings caught within the brutal machinery of warfare. Young aviators who faced their demise with courage, if not always with prescient wisdom. Commanders tasked with making critical decisions under immense pressure, armed with incomplete information. Mechanics toiling frantically to prepare aircraft they would never witness fly again. Sailors bravely battling uncontrollable fires, steadfastly remaining at their posts until their very last moments. Their narrative deserves to be recounted, not to glorify defeat or war, but to underscore the profound human cost of military aggression and the devastating price of imperial ambition. Lieutenant Commander Fushida, despite some lingering questions regarding his post-war veracity, perhaps encapsulated a profound truth when he converted to Christianity and became an evangelist, dedicating his remaining years to promoting reconciliation. While his specific recollections necessitate careful scrutiny, his personal evolution from a principal architect of the Pearl Harbor attack to an advocate for peace mirrors the broader journey undertaken by Japan itself, transitioning from aggression to pacifism, from imperialistic ambitions to democratic governance, and from isolationist policies to active international cooperation. The overarching lesson of Midway, viewed from the Japanese perspective, is ultimately that no nation, regardless of its power, can afford to disregard its adversaries, overestimate its own capabilities, or ignore the continuously evolving realities of modern warfare. The same aircraft carriers that had appeared invincible during the assault on Pearl Harbor proved tragically vulnerable at Midway. The same pilots who had achieved sweeping victories encountered their match in the skilled American dive bomber crews. The same strategic doctrines that had proven effective against divided enemies faltered when confronted by a unified and well-informed adversary. In the final analysis, the waters that enveloped the Japanese carriers at Midway were the same waters that would ultimately cleanse the militaristic fervor that had propelled them into battle. The young men who perished believed they were fighting for their emperor and their empire. They could not have foreseen that they were, in fact, dying for the genesis of a new Japan, one characterized by peace, prosperity, and democratic ideals. Their sacrifice, though tactically futile and strategically disastrous, served to highlight the inherent futility of military aggression and the insurmountable challenge of sustaining an empire through sheer force. This is the narrative of the Battle of Midway as seen from the Japanese perspective, a chronicle of pride preceding inevitable downfall, of human errors compounding into catastrophe, and of young lives tragically expended for the sake of strategic miscalculation. It is a story that warrants recounting, not to celebrate either victory or defeat, but to solemnly remember the profound cost of war and the steep price of imperialistic aspirations. For in the end, the waves that claimed the Japanese carriers at Midway were the very same waves that would eventually wash away the stains of militarism, leaving behind a nation fundamentally transformed and a crucial lesson for all of humanity. That the path of aggression invariably leads to utter destruction, and that genuine strength is found not in conquest, but in the enduring pursuit of peace. The spectral remnants of Midway, both Japanese and American, serve as a potent reminder that war is not a glorious endeavor, but a terrible reality, not a triumphant culmination, but a profound tragedy, and that peace, however challenging to preserve, is invariably preferable to even the most decisive victory. Within the immense expanse of the Pacific Ocean, where the sunken carriers lie in their watery tombs, the only sound is the ceaseless movement of the waves, carrying no distinct Japanese or American voices, but merely the resonant echo of humanity's most costly lesson, that war, irrespective of its victor, ultimately yields nothing but profound loss.